post-fire recovery of the, sorry, that's okay, the Southern Greater Glider. And I'm writing this up as a Master's by Research. Before I begin speaking about that, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. So I've been in Canberra since 2021, so I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the land where I've lived and studied, the Ngunnawal, Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, as well as all the custodians of the land where I did my fieldwork, and there's been quite a few. So the Bidwell, Ewan, Gunner, Kurnai, Narragaow and Walbunga people. I really want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging from these lands, but also all of the lands in which I've done my work today all over Australia. I really appreciate being able to help look after country and pay my respects to country as well. I'd also, right off the bat, like to acknowledge that this was a very collaborative project and I had a lot of support from lots of different avenues. So I'd like to support my funders, collaborators, and also in-kind support, which is done by people who have given me a lot of their time and a lot of their experience. So today it's just a pretty brief structure, background info, overall aim, and going through my 2 chapters, future direction for the project, and my final acknowledgements. So as I'm sure a lot of us know here today, globally, there's been an unprecedented rate of biodiversity loss. Particularly in the last 40 years across the world, we've lost an average of 68% of our global wildlife population, and this is continuing. So this figure here is an adaptation from Leclerc et al., and it shows that if we continue to do nothing to help this problem, we'll continue to lose our species. Whereas if we implement management and conservation effort, we can do a little bit better. And then if we do this with sustainable efforts as well, we can hopefully get it up to past the point it was in 2010. So Australia is not unusual in this global biodiversity loss. We're actually known as the mammal extinction hotspot in the world. And we currently have more than 1,700 species and ecological communities that are listed as threatened. So whether that be vulnerable, endangered, or critically endangered. And the key threats to a lot of these species are habitat loss, degradation and fragmentation, altered fire regimes and invasive species, or a combination of all of these. A recent study has also come out by Cardillo and shown that Southern and Eastern Australia is actually predicted to be one of the worst non-marine mammal extinction hotspots alongside sub-Saharan Africa. So it's up there in the top 2, this area of the world that we're currently living in. And part of this is to do with wildfire as a significant threat to a lot of our biodiversity. So we've seen a shift in fire regimes, particularly since the invasion of Australia and subsequent colonisation. We've seen a shift from cooler burns with long intervals to high intensity burns that are much more frequent. We've also seen a massive increase in severity of these fires over time. So new terms are being labelled like megafire because our current terms of wildfire don't encompass the degree of wildfire we're seeing in a lot of these areas. And we're also seeing a lengthening of fire seasons. So even just in the past couple of weeks, we've had fires outside the south coast outside of the normal fire season. And with anthropogenic climate change projections, this is expected to increase as time goes on. It's also a really big reason that we had Black Summer, and I'm sure some of you were affected by it, and this affected people, the environment, the economy, and our livelihoods in general. It burnt for 8 months across 2019 and 2020. It affected 12.6 million hectares of Eastern Australia, and about 1 billion animals were killed, affecting 21% of Australia's threatened vertebrates. And one of these species that it affected is the southern greater glider. So the southern greater glider is Australia's largest gliding marsupial. It was recently split into 2 species. So as you can see the distribution map, the southern greater glider occupies roughly this area. There's still genetic studies trying to work out if it's a 2-species split or a 3-species split and where that genetic split actually occurs. The southern greater glider is similar in characteristics to the northern greater glider. It's just bigger, and it's a folivore. It lives in eucalypt-dominated forest, eats leaves similarly to the koala, and depends on hollows for survival and reproduction. So the overall aim of my thesis is to investigate how the black summer megafires affect the occurrence and recovery of the southern greater glider. And I've done this in 2 ways. So my first chapter is a modelling study, and the second chapter was a field intensive experimental design study. So chapter 1, this one has definitely taken up a lot of time, but Australian megafires alter the distribution of the southern greater glider across East Gippsland. So as I briefly mentioned, the southern greater glider is vulnerable to the effects of fire. It's also extremely vulnerable to the effects of heat in addition to this. So it has a thermoneutral point of 20 degrees, and when it goes over this, it suffers from dehydration, exhaustion, and eventually mortality. So this is quite hard for a species such as this. It's also particularly slow moving, and there's not that much data on how far it can move. So it can be very affected by very hot, fast fires. A really large extent of their range was affected by black summer. There's also been a lack of ongoing systematic monitoring across their entire range, which makes it hard to determine why things are happening. And there's limited information of where greater gliders persist after a megafire, particularly one like black summer. So the aim of this chapter was to determine the impact of black summer megafires on the occurrence of southern greater gliders in East Gippsland. So I asked, how did the distribution of southern greater gliders change after black summer fires? And I hypothesized that occurrence would be higher in unburnt forest and areas in higher elevation. And this was because the literature seemed to suggest that these were factors that we would see in this study. So the study area was East Gippsland in Victoria. And if you haven't had the pleasure of visiting East Gippsland, it's the very eastern part of Victoria. It's a fairly large area, and you can see from this fire scale map here that majority of the area was affected by black summer. So a lot of forest was affected in these blazes. And so that was one reason for choosing this area. The second is that it supports southern greater gliders and some quite important populations of southern greater gliders, particularly around the Vendock area, which is in the north. We've also seen a lot of ongoing declines of these animals over time. So it's something that we're curious and had quite a concern over. And there is pre-fire and post-fire data available for this region, which was also enabled us to be able to do a study like this. So the study method I chose was after a lot of debate. So initially I wanted this chapter to be another field study with a randomized design, looking at greater gliders in different severities, but I spent a month in the field spotlighting and did over 30 surveys and only found 4 greater gliders. And so that really wasn't enough to do the study design that I had envisaged. So it moved to Maxent modelling. This is a really commonly used method in ecological studies. It's designed to work with presence-only data. And it means that you can use existing data from large-scale data sets where you don't have any absence data or you're not sure about the integrity of the absence data. It uses environmental predictor variables. So for me, interested in fire, I can use different fire-related variables and other environmental variables that might be specific to the species. And then it generates a predicted suitability distribution for the species that you're looking at. So the map on the screen is just taken from ALA. There may be some inaccuracy as we've got some southern greater gliders in the ocean. They definitely can't swim. And also one towards the Northern Territory, which I'm not really sure fits the description of the eucalypt-dominated wet forest. But this is just an example of being able to take this data and then look at everything and exclude results, but it gives you a much wider data set to work with. So the methods that I employed was I collected location records from 3 different databases. I used my own surveys that I conducted across 2021 and 2022. This was for post-fire records only. Then I used the Victorian Biodiversity Atlas, which is similar to the ALA, but it's Victoria specific, and a lot of researchers like the Arthur Rylah Institute feed into this. So it's really good quality data. And this was for pre-fire and post-fire records. And I also used pre-fire records from the Goongerah Environment Centre, which I did hand transcribe. And so that really added a little bit more to the number of records I had. I divided these into pre and post-fire, and I used an equal sample size. So I had 2 years before the Black Summer fires and 2 years afterwards, and I excluded that during bit as multiple fires were popping up at all different times, and we couldn't be sure when surveys were undertaken throughout that time. Because Maxent modelling requires rasters in the form of a matrix, we use a 250-metre cell. So other studies that have done modelling on the greater glider use a 250-metre resolution. This means my results could be useful in those studies if they wanted to combine predictive variables or use location records. But as the greater glider also has a fairly small home range, it seemed to encompass that. By spatially thinning the records, it means you're not double counting any cell, and you're just having a presence and an absent cell that can then be compared to background points. So I then randomly got a number of background points from this area which didn't overlap with the presence points, and then they were able to compare the presence and the absence. Then a lot of studies don't use this, but recent work has suggested this can make your modelling stronger. One of the problems with Maxent modelling is how you deal with bias, especially when you're using presence-only records. And so to do that, I used a target background group method. So that means I compiled all of the records of other species in the area, so brush-tailed possums, sugar gliders, which shows survey effort in that area. And then I used that as a predictor variables to account for that bias in my modelling. I then compiled the predictive variables that I wanted to work with. And ultimately, I evaluated the models using the AICC criterion. So looking at which was the best fit model for the pre-fire and for the post-fire. So just to give you an idea of the predictive variables I used elevation based on that work that has suggested that they're more likely to be found at elevations higher than 750 metres. I use ecological vegetation class, which is a class strategy across East Gippsland, and different states have different ways of doing it, which groups all the dominant habitat types. This is really important for a forest-dependent species, so kind of a base environmental data. I then used fire frequency. I modified this shapefile, so all of the other files are freely available from the Victorian Government map site. I did have to modify this so that for every single cell, I could get how many fires were in that area. So up to 7 fires from 0 to 7 was the range that we're working with across East Gippsland. Then there was fire severity. This is the only variable that I just used for the post-fire modelling because pre-fire there was no Black Summer. So this was done by the mapping that the government provides as well. I did time since last burnt, so how long since that area had been burnt, and also land management. It's a bit of a funny one, but I tried to use logging layers to see, you know, some form of habitat disturbance to the area, but it wasn't big enough across that entire area. So instead of that, I used land management as a proxy. So National Park didn't have any logging in the time period we're looking at, and State Forest did. So it was kind of like a yes and no, and I could use that within my modelling. You'll also notice that the fire variables are just post 1980, and that's again due to the integrity of the data before 1980. And I had a lot of help from Chris Taylor with this mapping work, and he suggested that's the best way to go about it. So that target background group method that I was talking about is the sampling bias predictor. So I did kernel density estimates, which shows this kind of heat map. And you can see from the pre-fire, there was a fair amount of survey effort in the western area and that central eastern part. But then when comparing it to the post-fire, there was much more survey effort done in that eastern central part. So that bright yellow means a lot of effort done, and the blue means basically none. Sometimes after fire, there's a lot more survey effort, a lot more funding to be able to go into these species, and you can kind of see that difference in survey effort before and after. At the end of the day, this is what you get from a Maxent model. It's quite a pretty map, and Maxent models are worked out based on a suitability score. So 0 means not suitable at all for predicted occurrence, and 1 means highly suitable predicted occurrence. So there's 2 main hotspots in this area, which got the bright yellow, the 1. And the variables that fed into this model for the best fit was sampling bias, land management, elevation, and vegetation class. So interestingly, no fire variables before Black Summer were considered to be important enough in this modelling to predict where they were going to occur. It was all of those other factors that we would expect. And then some of you might notice the change, tried to put it in the same position. But basically, we've seen a decline in the amount of highly suitable predicted occurrence area, and there's also been a decline for that mid-suitability. So around the coastal areas particularly, there's been a decline in where the species is meant to be, and the model includes different predictive variables. So you have elevation, sampling bias, fire frequency, fire severity, vegetation class, and land management. So a lot more variables have gone into this, and the fire variables were really quite important in terms of the predictions. So to conclude for this chapter with my overall results, predicted distribution declined by 14% after Black Summer from before fire to after fire. So it might not seem like a huge amount, but when we're talking about a species that has already been declining, there's been ongoing population declines, and there's incremental losses in habitat as time goes on. 14% after 1 megafire is actually quite significant for the longevity of that species. Higher elevation areas were found to have higher occurrence. So all of the predicted occurrence areas were over 800 metres in elevation. Now, for my study, whether this was a symptom of fire behaviour, I didn't test that, so I can't be sure, but it does seem to align with other recent work that's looking at higher temperatures and things like that, but definitely something that needs more research. And I also found that lower fire severity areas had higher occurrence. So no areas of occurrence were within areas that had been extremely burnt, so complete canopy scorch. And all of the predicted occurrences were where the fire had been 0 or 1 fire, so nothing over that. So it does signify that increased fire frequency and increased fire severity doesn't assist them persevering. And whether that's because of the mortality during the fires and just so many of them died in that extreme scorch area, or whether that's something more to do with also food availability and being able to have time to go back into those areas once mature canopy grows. So my second chapter, nest boxes as a recovery tool for the southern greater gladder in a fire-affected landscape. So nest boxes are a commonly used management tool, and they've been used for numerous different species with varying success. There hasn't been to date any evidence that greater gladders use nest boxes in burnt landscape, although they have been found to use them in other unburnt areas. And often targeted studies require purpose-built nest boxes if you're trying to target a particular species. So my study aim for this was, can purpose-built nest boxes assist in the short-term post-fire recovery of the southern greater glider? Question 1, do southern greater gliders use them? 2, are there more southern greater gliders in areas with nest boxes as opposed to those without? And do other species occupy these nest boxes? So this is really where all of the people come in. This has been a really big collaborative project, and you can see at the bottom there is a paper detailing all of what I'm going to skim over in terms of the nest box design. So if anyone's particularly interested, Howard et al. Is your best bet. Here we have just a summary of what went into the nest box design. So essentially the aim was to try and make these nest boxes as cool as possible so that when they weren't into burnt habitat, they weren't going to negatively affect the greater gliders that would potentially use them. So on the left-hand side, you can see that there's insulation using foil board and an air gap on every single side, top and bottom, except for the base, which went against the tree and would provide some thermal buffering. Then there's 3 coats of fireproof sealer, and the whole box was made with marine ply. Then the external factors are a smaller entrance hole. So that's to try and detract larger species like brush-tailed possums from going into the box. They can be quite significant competitors. And we put 3 coats of white paint. So this white paint was tested and actually reflects heat. And again, hoping to keep the box cooler inside. These couldn't have been done without engaging with the Yass and Holman shed. I remember when I first engaged Peter to help with the testing, and then they were happy to keep going, and they built 120 nest boxes, and Greening Australia built 114 nest boxes. And then big shout out to Ewan, who helped me paint all of these nest boxes over the summer, ready to go out into the field. So the 2 study regions where these nest boxes were to be deployed, again, is East Gippsland, but similar to some of the things I've mentioned with a low density population, not as many gliders as we had hoped. Some of these sites couldn't be within the wildfire scar and had to be in the prescribed burn scar. So on this map here, you have state forest is the pink overlay, national parks the green overlay. You can see that wildfire scar underneath, and the orange is prescribed burn. That was done in recent years. So trying to replicate a low severity burn that the wildfire might have left. And then the red and yellow are the sites. Because of this, I also added on Talaganda National Park, so it's only an hour out of Canberra. And that really northern section at the top there, that top northern part was burnt quite significantly through Black Summer. And so you can see the sites here. So there was only 2 sites in the state forest compared to all of the other sites which are in National Park. And selecting sites genuinely is probably where I spent a lot of my time during La Nina. Roads were blocked, bogging was an issue, rain, we had snow in May, but managed to set up 19 nest box sites in East Gippsland and 19 control sites. And these were done on a 1-to-1 match. So 1 treatment was matched to 1 control. And in Talaganda, I had 20 nest box sites to 10 control sites. So this was a 2-to-1 match. So I'm not planning to compare these sites. They're so vastly different anyway. But the reason for the differences in matching is because of the size. So East Gippsland encompasses multiple national parks, multiple state forests. It's a really big area. But Talaganda is quite small. And so with the study design that I developed, we just couldn't fit in more sites than we had. Each of the sites were matched by ecological vegetation class, fire severity and forest age. So this was done through mapping, but also by me in the field and using the 2 to try and work out the best match. So the only difference in those pairings was that 1 had nest boxes and 1 didn't. So this is the site design, and it's a little hard to visualize because there's so many areas and so many sites, but essentially every site is a 300 by 100 meter transect, and that 300 meter transect has been marked out by flagging tape, reflective tape, metal markers, so you can walk along it at night. It starts at least 25 meters off the road, or if it's along the road, it's over 50 meters from the road to prevent any disturbance. And then on a control site, that's just it, that's the whole site. And then on the nestbox site, you have 6 nest boxes deployed. They're deployed evenly along the transect, so 2 at the 50 meter, 2 at the 150 meter, and 2 at the 250 meter. And the reason for some of this was I got advice from someone that said if another animal is going to use it, if you have them in pairs, maybe that one will use it and the greater glider can go in the other one if that's empty. But that's not what I was testing. So maybe someone else at a later stage can see if that actually works. Then finally, every single site was 1 kilometre apart. So that's so they could be treated independently, and hopefully there wasn't any crossover between individual animals into other sites. And then was the deployment, and I did not get up in the trees, but thankfully for some really clever people, they did. So nest boxes were deployed between March and May. There was 114 deployed in East Gippsland and 120 in Talaganda. And again, we were trying to really target the greater glider. So they live up in the canopy. So we wanted 8 meters as an absolute minimum. Some of the trees in Talaganda are a lot smaller than the trees in East Gippsland. So the East Gippsland ones are definitely higher than 8 meters. I would say like 10 to 20 meters. They're very high. They were put on mature trees, ideally with a trunk wider than the nest box. They were also put on the southeastern aspect to help with, again, the temperature, not having that midday sun. And they were all on different trees within 50 meters of the transect point. And I did 2 different monitoring methods. So before nest boxes went up and around after nest boxes went up, I did spotlighting surveys with the double observer method. So 2 observers 15 minutes apart. Each observer was counted as an independent survey. We began 1 hour after sunset to whatever time of the morning. I'm really sorry for those that were with me till the sun went up, and all arboreal animals were recorded along this transect. So the location, the bearing, the distance. I also had cameras at a subset of sites. So in East Gippsland, there were 28 cameras, and in Talaganda, there were 26 cameras. There was 1 camera on 1 nest box, 1 at the 50 meter point, 1 at the 250 meter point, and they were facing the nest box entry to hopefully see if there was any occupancy. So question 1 results, Talaganda. Unfortunately, we couldn't put the cameras up straight away with the nest boxes due to a few delays, but when the tree climbers went there in July with me, we found that 19% of the nest boxes with cameras were already occupied by southern greater gliders, and this increased to 38% 6 months later. So just an incidental observation which showed pretty clearly that they were using them, and multiple were using them. So there were many nest boxes where there was like 2 or 3 in there. Then for the camera trapping, there was 0 data for 2 cameras. I think one of them fell off. And the rest of them recorded for up to 144 nights. We definitely learned a lot from that camera setup because the animals are prone to swiping the cameras and twisting them around. So it isn't a complete even sample size, but they were observed at 16 of the 24 nest boxes, which meant they were at 12 of the 13 sites. And they were seen to use, so inside, entering, exiting, at 9 nest boxes, so 37.5% of sites. And I also found that they were only seen at cameras that recorded for greater than 60 days. So they were seen at the nest boxes, but not necessarily using them. And then East Gippsland. So this data was super recent, so it's quite summary. I only got it a week ago. And I was going to come and say that no, nothing used them, but it is a different story now. So the first time the SC cards were changed, there was 0, nothing. And then it went to 3.5%, which is just one nest box, but it sounded a bit nicer, occupying 12 months, and this is him or her. I just think they've got a bit of swag about them. So yeah, that's that one nest box occupied by a southern greater glider. My second question, are there more southern greater gliders in areas with nest boxes compared to those without? There was no significant difference between nest box and control sites in either regions. I used GLMM modelling in R and used a different number of variables. So I had time, I had treatment or control site, fire severity. Unfortunately, there was no significant results in East Gippsland at all. So it didn't matter what model I tried, just nothing. But there was significant differences in Talaganda. So this is using the spotlight monitoring. As time increased, so did greater glider abundance. This does make sense because the first round of surveys, you would expect that the greater gliders weren't at carrying capacity after those fires, and then it was after a breeding season. So we'd hope that they did increase in numbers along our transect lines. And secondly, I found that as fire severity increased, there was a decrease in greater glider abundance. So this was also significant across the sites in Talaganda. You can see here that as burn severity gets to 100% canopy scorch, we saw less greater gliders. And this is just an example of what 100% canopy scorch looks like. So this is a site from East Gippsland, but the Talaganda ones are similar. There's no canopy leaves, it's all epicormic growth. And then question 3. Do other species occupy purpose-built nest boxes? And originally, no. I saw no species occupying nest boxes in Talaganda or in East Gippsland until this last round of camera data, in which I found that actually numerous sites were occupied by other species. So a third of the nest boxes in East Gippsland were occupied by sugar gliders. That involved also juveniles being born. So fully living in the nest boxes day in, day out. In one case, the greater glider that's living in it actually pushed the sugar glider out. So I haven't found the greater gliders to bring in any leaves or anything. They just sit in their poo, but the sugar gliders make a nice green nest. And so obviously the greater glider said, nah, that's mine. These boxes are for me. But that's the only case. All of the other sugar gliders seemed to be quite happy there based on the camera data and the numerous photos. There was also one mountain brush-tailed possum that was occupying a nest box. I have about 2,000 photos of this guy trying to get in. You can see that his face is very squished. So clearly we didn't do a good enough job of making it smaller. So that's definitely a lesson. He got in the end. I also observed yellow belly gliders, feather-tailed gliders, anaconda species and bat species, all observed in East Gippsland, but none were considered to use the nest box. And feather-tailed gliders frequented so many sites. They were active around all the nest boxes within Talaganda and East Gippsland, but again, they weren't considered to use them. They were kind of just jumping off them and going in and out, I guess, which makes sense with their kind of activity pattern. So I just wanted to show you this because it's super cute. So this is one of the nest box sites in Talaganda, which had a mum and her baby, and I saw that come out like over the time that I was recording those camera images, and that happened at another site as well. So Talaganda is definitely a breeding population, which is nice to know. So I can definitively say that they do use purpose-built nest boxes in burnt landscape, and that's great news, knowing that they actually do, and we've used a proper study to find this out. Nest boxes were not found to increase southern greater glider occurrence in the short term, so none of my results were significant, and this does signify that potentially it's not a short-term method, but at the same time, this has been developed as a long-term experimental study. So some of those results might not come out in the first year or two of work, and we'll need a lot longer to actually see whether that has made a difference in populations and recolonisation of those areas. And thirdly, other arboreal mammals were found to occupy the nest boxes. This is not necessarily good or bad at this point in time, but definitely something that needs further research. And again, really comes down to how much money is being spent on targeted nestbox and whether it's going to have the intended outcome. So another thing that needs more work into. And future actions for the project, I was just the beginning. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens with it, but there will need to be ongoing monitoring at sites, whether this continues with the spotlighting and camera data, or there's new methods coming up every day. So that will happen. I think that monitoring the use of nest boxes during a hot summer will be really important to see if it had the intended to make sure nothing bad happened with all of the work we put into making it cooler. There hasn't been a really hot summer since I started, so I haven't been able to look at that aspect. Rerunning analyses with additional data collected will help with working out whether nestbox sites can change abundance in different areas. And also further research into the difference between the two study regions. So this isn't something I've looked at, but clearly Talagander is a healthy reproducing population and the same hasn't been seen in East Gippsland. So looking into the reasons for that will be important for the whole species conservation into the future. I just wanted to thank everyone that I've worked with over the past 2 years. I've been able to do some really cool stuff like guest lecturing, presenting to so many organisations and collaborating with the community. So that's been really nice. And I'd also like to thank a bunch of people. So I'd really like to thank my supervisors. I definitely couldn't have made this into scientific studies and papers that can be published without them. Also to all of my volunteers, so mainly all of the friends that I've made in the last 2 years, like thank you so much. And the research assistants, the field staff, the work health safety staff, and also the HDR cohort, but also those interstate. I was really lucky that there's a whole heap of Greater Gladys students and they're really supportive, and I really thank them for everything. And the people who kept me employed throughout. It's been inflation, so I can't be thankful enough for getting paid a little bit extra and being able to have a bit of fun on the side of my research. Thank you very much. And if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Done. That was great. It's really interesting, and you've done a lot. So does anybody have any questions? Tasha.
Jenna, really great study, really interesting to see your results. I was actually curious about the occurrence in the Gippsland pre and post fire study. And you said you didn't find any effects of fire with pre-fire distribution.
Yes, with the modelling. Yeah, no, it wasn't considered in the best fitting model.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was only 2 years. So it's hard to know because we only had 2 years post. So for me to compare, I want an equal sample size. But no, it wasn't considered at all.
It's interesting to know because they have a lot of fires that region, the New Fire, the Alpine fires, the 09 fires. So I guess I was wondering whether it's different types of fire. Do you have times with fast fire, but when you had like street iceberg fires and times in that last iceberg fires, I think that might have come up with it.
No, that would be good to look at. I only use 5 frequency and they also were in areas predominantly unburnt before the fire. So then when it went to post fire, they were in a 1 fire. So that was the Black Summer. But like before that, they were pretty much in areas that hadn't been burnt since 1980 through wildfires, not including prescribed burns. Yeah, because they're a lot smaller.
We have some online questions. Giselle says, great talk, Jenna. And Claire Crane asks, do you have any idea yet how long the animals use the boxes for before roost switching?
It really just depends. Some of them, like that mum and baby, they were there every single night in the same nest box the entire time. And others would just go in and then go out again. So yeah, I think it's a bit independent of the species.
Thanks, Jenna. That was great. I assume nest boxes were put up because there's the assumption, like there was in a lot of studies after Black Saturday, that the fires would decline the number of natural hollows. So the question is, did you measure tree hollows? Natural tree hollows? And was there a difference between, if so, was there a difference between burnt and unburnt sites? Or was there a relationship between the occupancy of nest boxes and the number of natural hollows?
No, I didn't measure tree hollows. That's definitely something that would be really important to do. I know that Ben Wagner did natural hollow surveys at a lot of the sites that the nest boxes were at, and he found plenty, like lots and lots of hollows. I guess the assumption was like, yes, would it help because hollows might have declined from the fire with all the trees falling down. That's probably something that needs to be done at some point. In saying that, I guess it's a really hard study to do, and in Talaganda, just from incidental observations, we found greater gliders in like hollows that you wouldn't even think was a hollow, like just in like a meter off the ground in this random cavity. So I think the estimates would also be underestimated, but also I didn't have time to do it at this point. So potentially someone else would do it in the future and make the results stronger.
Keita says, excellent summary of the really impressive work you've done, Jenna. Congrats. And Jay says, and I'm going to read this as Jay's written it.
Oh,
Go, Jenna. Woo! Obviously, funding for these types of studies is short term. What would you change about future studies to take into account picking up long-term change or differences between burn severities and greater glider abundance?
for funding.
Yeah. What would you change about future studies to take into account like the short-term funding, I suppose? Is that right, Jay? Yes.
Yeah. I guess this particular project had 3 years of funding, which helps with a long-term study, and a lot of the cost was in the implementation of it. And once that cost is like done, like it is a really high cost, but then monitoring the sites can be done with a lot less cost, and it ultimately is labor cost. So I guess if you have research assistants or students doing that, you can cut the cost quite a lot. And with a species like the greater glider, they're quite slow and they breed once a year, so you can reduce the monitoring when you have funding. I hope that answers that in some way.
And one more question from online.
Sure.
This is, did you monitor the temperatures in the boxes?
No, I didn't have time to do that, and we didn't consider it really. Well, yes, the temperatures were monitored by Easy in the boxes when we designed it, and that's what that paper covers. In terms of in the bush, no, we didn't, but we didn't consider the temperatures at that point. It wasn't part of my study, and it was really looking at a hot summer. So that's kind of where that cost would go to, I guess, prioritizing.
Well done.
Thank you.